A bit of NATO story time. I worked as an observer coach trainer on an artillery team and as the logistics planner at the Joint Multinational Readiness Center in Germany in a time period immediately following Russia's initial invasion into Crimea back in 2014. In the first few rotations, we were honestly still training counterinsurgency operations focused on things like the Middle East. And I mean, at the time, we were still in Afghanistan. But we rapidly pivoted to what was termed near-peer operations with a focus on Russia. We were the European training center in Hohenfels, so what Russia did became very real for us, and we worked with the Ukrainians, and we were the testbed for a new potential fight against Russia. No more air superiority, no more giant talks with lights and heating and everything like that. No more green bean coffee between missions. And I, as someone who really didn't like work on counterinsurgency operations, certainly dove headfirst into the future of warfare with a near-peer foe. So fast forward to the summer of 2022, and we had years of refining the process. And though I was no longer still in Europe, I still had contact with many planners there. And at the time, Vladimir Putin's war machine had been rolling through Ukraine for 6 months. NATO, the world's most powerful military alliance, suddenly found itself wondering, if push comes to shove, could we really defend ourselves against Russia? Well, we learned rather quickly as Russia bumblefucked its way through Ukraine that, yeah, we probably could, but that didn't mean NATO could remain complacent. Enter General Christopher Cavoli, 4-star general in the U.S. Army and NATO's new military chief. And he realized to combat that complacency, he needed to embellish the current state of the global military balance of power. So he said multiple times NATO was at a disadvantage against Russia. And NATO's Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, also known as SHAPE, had grown complacent. We all knew what he was doing, painting a bleak picture to ensure we understood. Nonetheless, we also recognized that on paper we had nearly every advantage against Russia. But we had to be serious about that advantage and once again not be complacent. So Cavoli was on a mission to turn SHAPE back into the powerhouse war command it once was. And you can't do that by saying, we'll be fine. So I get his rhetoric. And I mean, SHAPE at one point served something like 3 million NATO troops and 100 divisions. So anyway, the near-peer tactics we at JMRC were already working on began to inform the process. However, unlike Hohenfels, for SHAPE, this wasn't just about brushing off the cobwebs of old tactical doctrine. This was a full-scale reboot to transform current strategy for the 21st century. NATO was in the process of ramping up its response force by something like 8-fold, and General Cavoli had plans to completely redefine SHAPE into a dynamic war room, one that could call in troop reinforcements, plan strategic strikes, and map out the battlefield well before Russian forces had even crossed any of NATO's borders. And this was new territory. NATO wasn't just preparing for defense anymore. For the first time in decades, it was gearing up to possibly hit Russian targets on their own soil before any shots were fired in a NATO country. And this was based solely on observed buildups and credible intelligence of a future Russian attack. And so, as I said, for the first time in decades, NATO was training on invading Russia. They were doing it at training centers like Hohenfels, Grafenwehr, Chinku, Romania, and Bydgoszcz, Poland. But for those that know the normal training cycle at these training centers, I want to pause for a second. I want to emphasize that this wasn't just another round of military exercises. We're talking about NATO's biggest military shakeup in years. They aren't just moving some troops around, flying a few jets over Europe, then high-fiving and checking a block. NATO's war room in Mons became a fully operational nerve center capable of directing forces, launching long-range strikes, and coordinating everything from ground units to fighter jets and logistics, all with the precision of a massive military brain trust that stretched, honestly, across the globe. But here's where it gets really cool. They made this transformation in just 2 years, and they did it with somewhat of a ragtag group of military planners from half a dozen nations. And I say ragtag somewhat tongue-in-cheek because these are some very brilliant planners. And this Tiger team was made up of military officers who actually volunteered their weekends to reimagine NATO's command structure, and they did so in 8 weeks. They built a blueprint for how SHAPE would command a fight against Russia. So by December 2022, NATO's new game plan was given to General Cavoli. And it wasn't about small battles with insurgents anymore. NATO was readying itself for an all-out war with a nuclear superpower, and again, it wasn't just about defense. They were preparing to hit Russia where it hurts. General Cavoli knew that if Putin ever stepped foot on NATO territory, the alliance would need to strike deep into Russian territory, cutting off their war machine and crippling their supply lines. Think shock and awe in Iraq, but times 50. And for the first time in decades, NATO planners were mapping out how just to do that. In July of 2023, NATO's leaders met in Vilnius, Lithuania, and this new look shape got the green light. It now had the authority to plan strikes inside Russia. The Watch Center in Mons, Belgium, which really was just becoming a Cold War relic up until the invasion of Ukraine, now operates around the clock with a team of 85 personnel ready to handle any crisis that might flare up on NATO's borders. And NATO isn't just talking a big game here. With the recent exercise Steadfast Defender, they began flexing some pretty big muscles. It was the largest exercise Europe had seen in decades. Something like 90,000 troops, with Marines launching amphibious assaults off the USS Gunston Hall, tanks rolling across Europe's eastern flank, fighter jets screaming across the sky, all in preparation for the real thing. It was 5 months of training that ended on May 31st of this year, and I can tell you from absolute experience, a 5-month training event is massive. But it sent a clear message to Moscow. NATO is now ready for that fight. The new Allied Response Force became fully operational in July of 2024, and it's the tip of NATO's spear. It has something like 300,000 troops, when before we just had 40,000 troops. And they're ready to deploy at a moment's notice. The idea is simple here. If Russia makes a move, NATO will respond fast and with overwhelming force. But here's the beauty of this alliance. NATO doesn't own a single one of these troops. It's a unique setup where all of these nations came together, pooling their resources and trusting that the leadership and shape will call the right shots. So if NATO wants to win, every member nation has to step up and be ready to deploy their troops, their tanks, their jets, artillery, etc. The speed at which all of this happens could be the difference between victory and disaster. And if you're wondering how serious this is, just listen to General Ben Hodges, who's the former U.S. Army Europe commander, and he was actually my commander when I was in Germany. He said, quote, "The key to effective deterrence is the demonstrated capability to inflict real pain on Russia." So in other words, NATO's strategy is to build on one principle: make Moscow think twice before trying anything. Of course, this transformation had its challenges. Back in October of 2023, Shape ran a war game called Steadfast Jupiter, where they faced off against a fictional Russia-like enemy in Eastern Europe, and the result? NATO actually didn't steamroll their opponent, but they wore them down enough to force them to the negotiating table. But now, in 2024, with those refinements and a new understanding of Russia's current state, NATO is more confident that, if necessary, they could fire up that steamroller. But the tweaking isn't over. Optimizations are still needed in NATO's intelligence gathering capability, integrating artificial intelligence and fine-tuning every aspect of new types of warfare, especially drones. But in just 2 years, NATO has gone from a peacetime alliance to a war-ready force that is preparing to take on one of the most dangerous adversaries in the world. Let's just hope it really never has to come to